A never-ending conversation amongst gamers is the ongoing debate of what is or isn't an RPG. RPGs as a genre are gaining more popular than ever before. Even the most casual gamers seem to like some variation of an RPG. The RPG genre used to be very niche, due to their themes being typically medieval, which to many isn't the most interesting, and of course, how difficult they can be. Now, when I say difficult, I'm more talking about the time invested. Not only does it take a while to understand the mechanics of an RPG, but the overall experience, meaning mostly the story, can be close to, if not exceeding, over 100 hours just to beat the game. And a lot of RPGs actually take about 10 to 15 hours to even get interesting. This genre clearly was for the hardcore and dedicated gamer. And personally, I didn't get into RPGs until around high school. And funny enough, the games that I consider RPGs back then, others didn't. And you can always say, well, isn't a game normally labeled by the developer whether or not it's an RPG or not? Well, that's true, but gamers still question whether one is or isn't. So let's dive into this never-ending debate. Is there an actual difference between an RPG or a game with RPG elements? Now, before we get into this video, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share. This is a free way you can support the channel and help my channel grow. I have a goal of 1K subscribers, and every little bit helps. I'm truly grateful for your viewership and support, and thank you. I think the best way to kick this video off is to actually define what actually is an RPG. Instead of just giving my opinion on what an RPG is, I decided to do a little bit of research. What I found was the first known RPG was Dungeons and Dragons. By using the first RPG ever made and its mechanics and fundamentals, it should be able to guide us to understand what actually makes something an RPG. And although it's pretty obvious, I guess I should say an RPG stands for role-playing game. So for starters, D&D, or Dungeons and Dragons, has what they call a Dungeon Master, or DM. A Dungeon Master essentially creates the world of the game, from the monsters, NPCs, towns, and what they call scenes. The players control their own created character, and the player gets to decide what their character gets to do in each scenario that the DM sets for them. If the player does something uncertain, the DM will have them roll dice to determine the outcome. This could be a good or bad thing based on what the player's stats are on their character sheet. Now, stepping away from Dungeons and Dragons for a bit, we can relate these mechanics to video games. The Dungeon Master would be the developers in this sense. The developers create the world and everything we do in the game. Most RPG video games allow you to make a customized character, which would be equivalent to Dungeons and Dragons character sheets. The major difference I'm understanding so far is the freedom. You see, because Dungeons and Dragons is played by real people and in real time, the Dungeon Master can allow for any possibility imaginable. While a developer must make a strict experience based on technology, budget, time, and many other factors, the freedom provided in Dungeons and Dragons simply can't be replicated in a video game. Of course, if we stopped here, we could argue no game is an RPG because RPG video games in nature are restrictive like we just said. But that would be really dumb to do, so we're just going to keep moving on. Now, the Dungeon Master isn't trying to beat the players either. Like I said, they are trying to give a fun experience, which can involve highs and lows, and you don't want the players to feel defeated at every event, nor do you want them to win every time. Once again, this is very similar to what developers do when they create a game. Now, this part of my research was actually pretty interesting. I have watched some YouTubers act while they were playing an RPG. What I mean is they're actually playing the role of the character that they're playing in game live while playing the game for us to see. So for example, if a YouTuber was playing a game like Skyrim and they decided to be a no good thief, they would imitate what that character would do in real life while they're playing. I'm bringing this up because although this isn't required to play Dungeons and Dragons, this is a main part of why many people do enjoy the game. They play Dungeons and Dragons to role play and they actually get into character. Now, yes, like I said, a video game does allow you to do this as you can do whatever you want with your own imagination at any time in life, but is this typical what most people would do while playing an RPG video game or playing any video game? Well, no. So to make a connection here, Dungeons and Dragons being the grandfather of RPGs to even remotely be similar to Dungeons and Dragons when it comes to video game RPGs, it required the player to actually be role-playing while they're role-playing in the video game, no different than someone role-playing while they're role-playing playing Dungeons and Dragons. Most of us, including me, we just kind of make a character that looks cool or maybe looks like us. We pick the stats we want to use based upon what playstyle we want, and then we just play. We don't sit there and pretend to be a certain character or talk in a funny voice. We just sit there and enjoy the game. So by definition, in order to truly be a role-playing game, the player must be allowed to actually role-play. And in order to do that, at the bare minimum, that will require player choice. Now, would an RPG without player choice disqualify it from being considered as such? Well, maybe not, because D&D, interesting enough, is so open in how you can play it, there is no one way to do it. You can actually play D&D with pre-made characters that have already been given traits and a name filled in that you had nothing to do with, which of course would be similar to RPGs like Final Fantasy VII and things like that, where the developer already created these characters that you just so happen to control. And while playing D&D, although many people do act and role play, you actually don't have to do that if you don't want to. You can simply just focus on having fun, whatever that means to you. And I found that to be pretty cool. So that's the basics of D&D, the original RPG. But what about in actual video games? Clearly RPGs use many elements found in D&D. We got character creation, quests, even turn-based combat. So why do we have a hard time knowing what game actually is an RPG? Well, that's because we have a thing called action RPGs. In my research, I found that the early action RPGs are commonly credited to be inspired by The Legend of Zelda. Keep in mind, The Legend of Zelda is an action adventure game. The Legend of Zelda was never considered an RPG until recently, which we'll get into, and the only one that actually was an RPG, or at least a game with RPG elements, was Zelda 2, a very different game compared to every other game in the franchise. So what is an action RPG? Many people think that action RPGs have these deep philosophical meanings and there's all these different ways that you can describe it, but I'll put it simple because it's actually pretty simple to understand what an action RPG is. All an action RPG is a real-time combat system. It may also focus less on story and characters, but the main part that makes it action is the combat. Some other traits are that the NPCs in action RPGs typically only have a few roles. They're normally just quest givers or someone that will trade or sell something to you. Due to the heavy focus on action, a lot of the times people can't tell if a game is an action RPG or a game with RPG elements. A game with RPG elements, in my opinion, would be a game that has very little or unimportant RPG mechanics. As an example, my favorite game of all time, or at least one of them, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. CJ can level up many stats from his weapons, driving skills, strength, and so on. CJ can even dress up, so that allows for the player to role play a bit or customize CJ how they want their CJ to look. CJ can even take on optional jobs and even date different women. Many of these are optional things you can do, while some will happen no matter what you do, because when you play the game, you'll just level up these stats no matter what. Only one stat really matters for one particular mission, but everything else you're just gonna happenstance get, and it doesn't really change the game. But don't forget that this is just my opinion. I deem GTA San Andreas an action game with RPG elements and not an action RPG. Someone else could easily say it is enough RPG elements to be considered an actual action RPG, especially if you look at it from the customization and dating aspects. You could easily roleplay your version of CJ, creating an entirely different way to play the game that's unique to your experience that no one else had while they were playing San Andreas. Now let's use another franchise that gets people confused. That's the Borderlands franchise, another one of my favorites. Now, in these games, you have create a class, character customization, leveling, builds, quests, gear, loot, and so on. But man, oh man, if I had a dime for how many people I have heard say that Borderlands isn't an RPG because it's a first-person shooter, well, I'll be a man with a lot of dimes. And it's a very strange argument, seeing as Borderlands has more RPG elements than modern-day Fallout, or even Starfield, or even Final Fantasy 16. Especially the recent Wonderlands Borderlands spinoff. This game fully goes D&D. Like seriously, like, you know, it's really the gimmick of the game. Like the whole gimmick is that like they're playing their version of D&D in the world of Borderlands. They even have character sheets, many side quests that aren't just busy work like standard Borderlands games have. These side quests actually mimic the adventures that you will find in a D&D adventure. Now let's talk about everybody's favorite, Tears of the Kingdom. Many now put Zelda in the RPG box, ever since Breath of the Wild. Me personally, I have zero idea why they're doing that, because it does have some RPG elements, but a lot of these RPG elements are by default just found in action adventure games. You know, like story and quest. Cause other than that, what possibly are these RPG elements that everyone is talking about? Is it the numbers on the weapons? I truly do not understand why they are putting Zelda in the RPG category. But I guess if the original Legend of Zelda inspired the action RPG, who's to say the ratio of action or RPG is needed to be a true hybrid? Either way you shake it, I still don't deem Zelda to be an RPG. The only one I would consider an RPG is Zelda 2, as leveling up and building up Link stacks actually is important. Whereas in Tears of the Kingdom Breath of the Wild, Link doesn't really have any stats. His armor does, and by default, you'll just be getting new weapons and gear all throughout the adventure. I really wouldn't call it an action RPG or even RPG. It's just an action adventure game. Since we brought up Zelda, then we got to go to Horizon Zero Dawn. Now, Horizon on the surface may appear to be an RPG. However, I would say it just has RPG elements. Horizon has dialogue choices, commonly found in RPGs, but they don't matter. Sure, you could play your version of Aloy technically by role-playing as a meaner Aloy or Aloy that's kind of kinder, but it doesn't change anything that happens. Like the people don't even really respond necessarily all that different than if you would pick a different choice. And outside of these choices, Aloy will behave however the devs chose her to behave, and typically that's pretty standoffish. You do have many side quests. You do get some armor, but you don't actually have classes. Plus, if we take a look at Aloy's skill tree, you don't create Aloy to play a certain way. She just has skill trees, which you eventually will get all of the skills anyway, and you don't have an actual build. Then there's combat. Many view games where the numbers pop up on the screen when you attack an enemy as an RPG. Sure, this is an element that you can find in many RPGs, but let me tell you a secret. As a former game developer, every game with damage done or is given has a number. This number represents the damage done or the damage taken. Just because the developer decides to allow this number to pop up on the screen does not mean that this is an RPG element, as technically it's just a game element. Besides, if you do view Horizon as an RPG, wouldn't Far Cry also be one? We laughed when people said Far Cry was Skyrim with guns. And no matter how many new RPG elements are added to that series, we don't call it an action RPG or an RPG at all. A great example of how blending action with RPGs has confused us all can actually be found in sports games. In many sports games, you can level up the character you're choosing. You can make a certain class based upon whatever position your character is in. You can even do this in racing games too, as there are different car classes and you have to level up the car, and the car has different skills. And if you want to make the car a drift build, or do you want to make it a street build or a dirt build, you can have RPG elements in plenty of things. And I would say a lot of sports games actually have more RPG elements than games that call themselves RPGs. But why don't we call these games RPGs or action RPGs? I went into this project trying to prove a point, And I wanted to show that there was a clear-cut difference between an RPG and a game with RPG elements. And after all my research and playing through many games, I finally came to this conclusion. It's all subjective. This isn't a cop-out answer either. You see, I was inspired to make this video because I heard someone say Borderlands is an RPG. Although their reasoning didn't make any sense, as they claim Borderlands doesn't have classes when it literally does, it still moved me to finally find a definitive answer. But through my research, I got an answer better than being right. I got a more positive understanding. See, hearing about the many ways D&D can be played, it opened my eyes that so can any RPG video game. Remember, some role play by really getting into their character, while others just want to jump in and fight monsters. Are either wrong? Well, no. Are you wrong for seeing the role-playing aspects in Tears of the Kingdom and calling it as such? No. And am I wrong for feeling that it's not enough to be considered an RPG? No, I'm not wrong either. At this point, so many games have RPG elements blended into them. Anything could be considered an RPG. From Madden, Call of Duty, Minecraft, GTA, you name it. And let's not get really crazy and add in the player's imagination. Now, any game, literally any game, could be an RPG if you add in people role-playing while playing the game. Now, you might say that's a stretch, but who's gonna stop you from saying it? If I want to play as a roided up golf clubbing murderer while trying to get a Joel in one, well, I'll do just that. With the power of your imagination, you can even disregard what the devs set up in many games. And isn't that the foundation that RPGs live and die on? Having fun with your imagination? Providing a base for those that lack imagination or need some form of rules so that things don't get too out of hand. So in conclusion, it really just doesn't matter. You could just play your games and have fun and call whatever you want an RPG, and call what you want to call an action game with RPG elements an action game with RPG elements. But never get the most important rule of all. My opinion is greater than yours.